Hello, and welcome back to the Open Door Cutting Room Floor podcast. My name is Clay Wright, and I'm actually the guest, technically speaking, on today's podcast because I recently preached a message out of Acts 17. And so I'm here with Charlie, Pastor Charlie from Avon Lake campus, and he's actually going to be hosting the podcast for us. So I'll hand it over to you,
Yeah, give
Charlie.
me the mic. Give me the mic. It's my turn to host. I've been living for this moment all week.
Oh, yeah, dude.
Yeah. So, Clay, I'm excited to dig in. Let's just dig right in. Why mess around? Let's just get into the text. So you preached in Acts, and you were looking at Acts 17, and just before we dig into it, we had talked about who is Paul, right?
Sure.
The Apostle Paul is new. He's a new character that we're coming to, and most people know who Paul was. He wrote most of the New Testament. But we've been going through the book of Acts for a number of weeks now, and this is really he's new. You know, these are now these weeks we're not going through. These are all, and now this will come out, and Jason will have preached as well. But we're not talking now. It's shifted. The focus is shifted to a new character.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about Paul. Who's this guy?
Yeah. So what's interesting is the Apostle Paul gets mentioned a couple times earlier in the book of Acts, and one of which we've seen. So we had Dr. Denver Daniel come in and preach, and he talked about the stoning of Stephen, which I think was Acts like 6, 7, 8, something around there. I suppose we could check, but in that story is the first mention of the man who will become the Apostle Paul.
That's right.
When it says Saul approved of the killing of Stephen, and he held coats for people so that they could get a better throw, that sort of idea. So you have the first Christian martyr, and Saul of Tarsus is his name. He approves of the killing. He's there, and then what we read later, as you read through the book of Acts, you find that he was so zealous. He was so zealous after the God of Judaism and these sorts of things that he believed that the Christians were just a scourge in the land, and so he sought out to basically exterminate them. So in Jerusalem, he was going around and rounding up people and like turning them into the authorities, getting them killed, putting them in prison, all these sorts of things. And he does that in Jerusalem for a while, and then he decides that that's not enough, and so he gets papers to go to Damascus to continue his persecution of the church. And you can read about this. There's a couple of times in the book of Acts that talk about this story. One account is when it's happening, and then other accounts are when Paul is retelling the story of his conversion. And they're very similar, but you get a little bit of a different taste each time. But if you have an NIV and you look at Acts chapter 9, the heading there is going to be Saul's conversion. So what happens is Saul is seeking to persecute the church. He's heading to Damascus with these papers that allow him to do so. And on the way, he sees this, a light comes down from heaven and flashes around him. He falls to the ground and hears a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And I've got a red letter version of the Bible, and so those words are in red because they're attributed to Jesus. Effectively, what happens is Jesus confronts Paul on the road to Damascus and says, he doesn't say, "Why are you persecuting the church?" He doesn't say, "Why are you persecuting the followers of the way? Why are you persecuting my disciples?" That's what Paul was doing, but that's not what Jesus says. He says, "Why are you persecuting me?"
That's right.
And so in that moment, Saul, who might have interpreted this as like a theophany, like you see in the Old Testament, he has to realize in one moment, Jesus is Lord, and the church is his are his people, and he is identifying with the church. So Saul's world is turned upside down. And some people like to say Saul turns into Paul. It's a little bit of a misunderstanding of what's happening. Saul and Paul are like, Saul is more of his Hebrew name. Paul is more of his Greek name.
Which is funny. One time I heard it was like a Bible quiz. It was like, when in Acts was Paul's name changed from Saul to Paul? When did Jesus change his name? And everyone thinks that
yes.
they think of Peter. And they think of some of the differences. But God never literally says your name will now be called Paul.
Yeah, there's a point where Paul is ministering, and it says it says Saul, who was, or Paul, like Saul, who was also called Paul, and then from that point on, it refers to him as Paul.
Yeah.
And the reason is because when Saul leaves Arabia and sort of the area where there have been Hebrews, like Jewish people, he's now ministering mostly to Gentiles, even though he's going into the synagogues. But when he's in the areas of Gentiles ministering to Gentiles, they refer to him as Paul instead. So this is a common thing. It's not, he doesn't go from Saul to Paul. He's Saul and Paul beforehand. He's also Saul and Paul afterward.
Correct.
So he has this conversion experience. He goes and he meets Ananias. Paul is blind, and then Ananias prays for him, and the scales fall off of his eyes, and that sort of thing. So it's really, really beautiful conversion story that, for one reason or another, we're not taking a pit stop there because there's so much else that we want to see in the book of Acts. So we've been preaching through, we got to Acts 4, 5, 6, 7, and now we're sort of jumping over Acts 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So we're jumping over a bunch of stuff because we've only got, we're only in this series for 15 or 16 weeks. We can't possibly preach the whole book. So we're jumping way forward. So Paul has been, he's come to Christ, and he spends some time in Arabia where he's spending that time with Jesus, studying the scriptures and being prepared for ministry. And then he goes and he's with the church in Antioch. And you can read about this in, I can't remember what chapter it's in, but Paul and Barnabas, they're worshiping in Antioch. Maybe it's Acts 11.
Yep.
Yeah. The end of Acts 11.
Yep.
Or somewhere around there. The Spirit designates Paul and Barnabas to go and to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So they get sent out on this first missionary journey. So they leave north from Antioch, which is north of Jerusalem. So they leave north from Antioch and they go up throughout the region above there. I think it's called Syria or something like that. And they go up into the areas where they go up and they plant some churches up in is it in the area of Asia Minor or what's like modern day Turkey?
Modern day Turkey.
And then they circle back around. They come back to Jerusalem. In Acts 15, you get the Jerusalem Council where they're like, okay, so now we have all these Gentiles who are believers, and do the Gentiles need to become Jews or not? Or how do we understand the Jewishness of Christianity, and yet now there's all these Gentiles coming in? And so in Acts 15, they have a council to deliberate that. And after Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas, which they end up breaking up very quickly after this, but they decide to take this letter and this from the Jerusalem Council back to all those churches that they planted on the first journey. So then they set out on this second missionary journey, and they go to all those churches, and then we see they try to get into Asia, and they're not able to. So then they go over to Macedonia, and this is what Jason preached about, Pastor Jason, a couple weeks back. They can't get into Macedonia, and so then they come down to or they can't get into Asia. They go into Macedonia, and then they eventually find themselves in Achaia. So I know that there's a lot of words there. You can Google maps of Paul's first and second missionary journeys if you're curious about kind of what happened. But to sum it up in one sentence, Paul and his missionary companions are almost single-handedly responsible for the gospel going forward out of Judea and accomplishing the Great Commission, accomplishing what Jesus said in the beginning of the book of Acts, and really for those of us who are non-Jews, preaching the gospel to our ancestors. Like we owe our salvation. If you were to trace it back generation after generation, eventually you would get to the Apostle Paul and his missionary companions for the vast, vast majority of Western people, which is just incredible. So I'm happy to be in this section where we're talking about Paul. If you think about the book of Acts as a whole, the first 8 chapters, or the first half of the book, which is not more than 8 chapters, but focuses in Judea, Jerusalem, and on the Apostle Peter. And then after the conversion of Saul, you get a couple more stories about Peter. He's having the vision with Cornelius and all that sort of stuff. But then after that, it sort of shifts focus to the Apostle Paul and his missionary journeys, which Luke, who wrote the book, was one of Paul's missionary companions. So if you paid close attention, at some point in Acts, the narrator starts using first person pronouns, so saying we went here, we went there. Well, that's because Luke was traveling with Paul. So that's a little bit of an introduction to Paul and his missionary journeys. Paul also wrote over half of the New Testament. So he wrote all these letters to these churches that he planted. So he's a massively important figure in Christianity, helping us to understand who Jesus was, how that applies to the global mission of Christ. And there's so much to learn from him and about him, but maybe that's a good
that's great. And I think another helpful piece as we dive into today's text, you mentioned this briefly, but there was definitely a shift in the understanding of the nature of the church, and Paul is truly the tipping point of that. Yeah. Like you said earlier in Acts, and as Paul, was working on, don't mind the clicking of the mic. All right. As Paul was, diving into his ministry, the focus was on the church being a Jewish entity. And in a sense, many of the early Christians would go to the synagogue. That's where they would go to do church, to be with other believers. And so they viewed it as a almost renewing or refining of Judaism. And what we see is that there's, after that council and those things, is there was a shift to say, no, listen, the Jews have been rejecting Christ. This is a new way. This is the way of Christ, and this is Christianity. And while it's built on the foundation laid by the Jewish religion, this is not Judaism in and of itself. Yeah. And we see that shift now, because now the Gentiles are being brought in, and now there's focus on big theological concepts like circumcision of the heart and what it looks like to be brought into the new covenant, brought in through Christ, and those things. It's some beautiful truth, and Paul is known for fleshing those things out. He's such a really deep writer, and he's known for one or two run-on sentences.
Well, and what's interesting about that, so in Acts 4, one of the passages we did preach on is Peter and John before the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish council, and they litigated all the issues within the Jewish people. And they say these are untrained and ordinary men, but they were with Jesus. And so Jesus had left this indelible impact on them and trained them and taught them these sorts of things. Paul is the opposite. Paul grew up in Tarsus, which was, there was a synagogue there, and he had access to really great teaching, and he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He talks about in one of his letters. What he means by that is, of all the Pharisees, I was like a star student. He knew the Torah, he knew the Old Testament scriptures forwards and backwards. He was extremely well taught, and on top of that, Tarsus was also a Hellenistic hub, which we'll talk about a little bit later, perhaps. But so he's this guy who sort of lived between worlds, where he was a Jew of Jews, but he also maybe had neighbors who were Greek-speaking people and who were Greeks. Like most of the Hebrews at this point would have spoken Greek. So, but he may have had people of other nationalities in Tarsus that he was running around with, that he knew.
We know at least he spoke 2 languages, but probably 3. Probably spoke Aramaic and Greek and Hebrew, likely. But he was at least fluent in Aramaic and Greek.
Yeah, and he probably learned Hebrew to study the Old Testament.
Yeah,
because Hebrew, after we could talk about the Roman Empire, or like I guess now we'd be talking about Greek Empire. But when Alexander the Great comes through and conquers the whole world, effectively, he spreads, like he built all of these cultural centers wherever he went to try to imbue Hellenistic culture into the whole world. So he was trying to unite the world, not just by conquering, but also through culture. And a part of that's why the Greek language is so prevalent. That's why our New Testament is written in Greek, even though it's written by almost entirely, if not entirely, Jewish people.
Because it's amazing. Did you ever read what happened with Alexander the Great and the Jews?
No.
There's writings in Josephus writes about this, but he actually came and did not conquer them. That's why they were not conquered before the Romans.
Before the Romans,
he made treaties with them as long as they were willing for him to influence them, and so he had influence over them through culture, but he never conquered them. He made treaties with the the Jewish people that were dwelling in that space at that time,
Interesting.
which is really interesting.
Huh.
And so that's why you never hear of the Greeks conquering, and Greek culture was actually accepted and very positive in light of the Jews because they had a very positive view of the Greeks. That's why you see synagogues all throughout the old Greek world before the Romans took over. That was because there was some unity between the Jews and the Greeks, which is fascinating, which set up the common language for the gospel to go forth.
Right.
And then the Romans come in and set up the roads.
Yes.
And the passageway. So it's amazing how God laid the framework through language and through roadways, the Roman roads.
Absolutely.
For the gospel to go forward. We're way off, man. That's good stuff.
Yeah. And Paul's the one who carries the gospel along those roads in that language.
That's
and
right.
So, yeah,
it's powerful.
Yeah, connects
good
back
stuff.
up.
Yeah, it connects back. Okay, so on one of these journeys, Paul, he comes to a place called Athens, and Athens is really the central hub of the Greek world.
Mm-hmm.
And not only the Greek government, but the Greek thought life, deep
Yes.
thinkers and things in Athens. And so he goes there and he's waiting for his companions to come. And it says in verse 16 to start off, it says, "Now while Paul was waiting for them in Athens," it says his spirit was provoked within him, and he saw that the city was full of idols. So I'll just make one note. I love this passage because how it talks about how he was waiting. And in the waiting, he was willing to hear from the spirit provoking. That's a really great tidbit to say. Sometimes we're too busy and we need to slow down and be listening. But I don't want to dig in too much to that. We have a lot to cover. So he's waiting, and he's waiting for his companions, but he's aware of his surroundings. And he starts to notice something, and that's idolatry. And so from there, he really dives into this really powerful story that you preached on a couple weeks ago. And it all centers around the idea of reasoning in the synagogue, talking with some of these thought leaders at the time. So as you were looking at this passage, and you first dug into it, what were some of the things that really stood out to you that you were like, wow, this is really good stuff? Even maybe it didn't make it into the sermon, but
oh man,
holy cow, it's a lot here.
So many things is the short answer. This is just such a packed text.
Mm-hmm.
I really struggled. Like even in my study, I was reading some of the densest commentary I had ever read on any passage, which I was surprised because normally in a narrative text, which we're reading a historical narrative, you don't get that dense. You don't get that far into the weeds.
That's right.
But this was like, each commentary had like 40 pages on these verses, and it just was, there was so much to see. I mean, one thing I'll point out that I mentioned in one of the services, but not the other, is that sometimes if people ask me what my favorite Bible verse is, I will often reference this passage, and the verse that sticks out to me is verses 26 and the following. But it's this idea that from one man God made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. So that verse, there's a lot going on there, but if you were to summarize that in your own words, it's basically God made everybody, and he put us on the earth. And so then you get to the next verse 27. God did this. He made everybody. He put them on the earth so that, or with the purpose that, they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. Some translations say feel their way toward him, perhaps to find him, though he is not far from any one of us. That verse, that truth speaks so much to my personal walk with Christ, because there are so many times when I feel like this word that they would reach out for him, feel their way toward him, perhaps to find him. That's a word in the Old Testament that's often used of a blind person stumbling around in a room. And sometimes it really does feel like in this, as we're seeking God, as we're pursuing him, it feels like we don't know what we're doing. We can't find God. Where is God? What's going on with all this? It can feel like in this relationship, we're doing all the work. God, where are you? I just don't understand. When are the lights going to come on? When am I going to see you close at hand? All these sorts of things. And so there's two encouragements here for anybody who feels and who struggles with like the hiddenness of God, or is feeling like they're searching after God but not able to find him. The first truth is that pursuit is a part of the purpose for which God made humankind.
Mm-hmm.
He put us on the world so that we would seek after him in these kinds of ways.
Yes.
So that thing that's within us that probably caused them to create this altar to the unknown God, if you read earlier in the text. But whatever that impulse is in us that seeks after God, that yearns for him, sometimes we call it the God-shaped hole, whatever you want to call it,
Mm-hmm.
that curiosity, that striving, that eternity being set in our hearts, that's something that God placed there and that pleases him. God
Mm-hmm.
saw that and he
Mm-hmm.
called it good.
Mm-hmm.
He created humankind to pursue him. So when we're struggling, when we're wrestling with the idea of God, when we're seeking him out, we're actually participating in something that's a part of God's design for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has been a huge encouragement to me.
Hmm.
That's one of the reasons why I love asking questions, is because
Yeah.
I believe that God created human beings
Mm-hmm.
to ask questions, to
Mm-hmm.
wonder, to engage in mystery,
Mm-hmm.
to pursue. So that's the first thing. And then the second encouragement is that all along the way in this whole process, as we're seeking God, perhaps to find him, even though it feels like we're wandering around in the dark at times, we do this with the knowledge that in the light of the fact that God is not far from each one of us.
Mm-hmm.
So even in these moments when it feels like he's far off, the truth that Paul is communicating to the Athenians is that God is not far off. He is close at hand. And those two truths, that God created me to pursue him, even in the times when it feels like I'm doing a poor job or it's not working out well, and the truth that in the midst of my pursuit that God is close at hand, even when it doesn't feel that way or even when it's not self-evident, those are truths that keep me going. They wake me up in the morning. And so that's why this is one of my favorite verses.
I
Because
mean, it's so good. I mean, especially we've had conversations even recently that's like, wow, that Lord's is good. That hits, man.
So I need that verse. But you know, if you go back and listen to my sermon, I didn't talk about that at all in this text, because this is like a subpoint of a subpoint of Paul's broader argument.
That's right.
So I could preach a whole sermon on that, just those two verses.
Yeah.
But instead, I just felt like I was being led to take a look at Paul's approach, so that we can emulate Paul, as we're trying to see God act now. So, but that's one thing that stuck out to me from the passage. Another thing that stuck out to me is this idea of the fact that Paul was approached by the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers.
Yeah.
I spent almost an embarrassing amount of time reading about Epicureanism and Stoicism and trying to figure out, like, okay, so Paul's interacting with these two thought groups. What's going on with all that? Like, who were the Epicureans? Who were the Stoics? How is Paul addressing that in his speech? And so I could talk a long time about that. I don't know if, maybe I'll talk a little bit about it.
Yeah. So let's get into that. So at first thing, it's interesting that it says in verse 17, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews.
Which one thing, let me say about that real quick.
Yeah.
That word, he reasoned with them, it can also be translated, he addressed them. In the NIV, it says, what does it say? Yeah, he reasoned in the synagogue. The Greek word there is dialogeto, which sounds like our word dialogue. And etymologically, that's our word dialogue comes from this Greek word dialogeto, or it would be dialego in the lexical form. But one thing I wanted to point out, I didn't really point out strongly, but I said it in passing, is that Paul is not going in and preaching at these people. He's having conversations with them. I thought that was so cool when I realized that.
That is true. Yeah.
Anyway, I know I interrupted.
No, you're good. He's reasoning with them and devout persons. And then there's a shift. It says, and in the marketplace every day, with those who happen to be there.
Yes.
So this is obviously he's been there a little while, a number of days.
Right.
It seems like, who knows, a couple of days, couple of weeks, whatever. But he seems to be making a name for himself.
Right.
He's stirring the pot a little bit. He's really good at that, stirring the pot. So he's reasoning enough that word must be getting out, because then he's approached and starts to have a conversation, which I love that it says, at least in the ESV, he conversed with him or had a conversation with him. So it sounds like they were curious and just wanting to talk and learn more as well.
Yes.
So they begin to engage. So I'm going to limit you, Clay. Give us, like, if I'm going to have a test and I'm like, I didn't study, I need to read the Spark Notes. I'm going to Spark Notes or Cliff Notes. I want to read one paragraph, a blurb about who the Stoics were, and one blurb about the Epicureans.
I've got blurbs pulled up, so
Give me a blurb.
I'll be limited. So the Epicureans and the Stoics were two different philosophical ways of thinking in the ancient world. They both started in the 300s BC or around about there by certain men. So Epicureanism was founded by a guy named Epicurus. And here, I'll read this little paragraph here. It says, the Epicureans pursued pleasure as the chief purpose in life and valued most of all the pleasure of a peaceful life, free from pain, disturbing passions and superstitious fears, including the fear of death. They did not deny the existence of the gods, but they believed that the gods had nothing to do with men. So they had these sort of highfalutin ideas where, like, man, what life is really about is pursuing pleasure, but really like the higher pleasures, the pleasures of intellectualism and peace and living a well-examined life and these sorts of ideas. So they weren't, sometimes they get caricatured as people who were just hedonists, like who were just seeking pleasure wherever it can be found. In theory, they were not, but in practice, a lot of times that's sort of what ended up happening. So they would have these highfalutin ideas, but then in practice they would be like, well, there's actually this saying where they were like, I wish I could find it, but they were like, there's nothing to fear in death. I won't know what's going on anyway. I might as well live it up for now. That was sort of the mantra or the theme of Epicureanism. So they thought that the gods were far away. And so that may be similar to what people think about as deism. Deism is a system where there's a god, but he's more like a clockworker. He builds the world, sets it in motion, and then stands back. Yeah. So God or the gods are far off. And so what we should do, instead of trying to serve the gods all the time, is we should seek pleasure out. It should be the higher pleasures, but really in practice, it ended up being fairly hedonistic. Yeah. The Stoics, on the other hand, were quite different. So the Stoics, they followed a guy named Zeno. Zeno, and both of these people taught in Athens at the time, in life. But Zeno, he would teach in these porches called the Stoa, and so his students would gather in the Stoa. That's why they were called the Stoics. Stoa were these long hallways of columns that they built.
I didn't know that.
To shade the area.
That's cool.
The Epicureans met in gardens, so it's so interesting.
Wow, that is cool.
So the Stoics, they were pantheists. So pantheism is the belief that God is in everything, or everything is God, and they put great emphasis on moral sincerity and a high sense of duty. They cultivated a spirit of proud dignity and believed that suicide was better than a life lived with less dignity. I didn't realize that. But so the Stoics, what they were about, so the Epicureans, they were chasing pleasure. They were really trying to engage and that sort of thing. The Stoics, they were much more reserved. They were trying to follow the way of nature. They were trying to, because if God is in everything, if God is in nature, then, well, let's look at nature. Let's see what we can learn from that. And so they very much were a more reserved group of people. That line about proud dignity is a great description of the Stoics. They didn't want to show lots of emotion. They were trying to sort of be this and this may be a little bit of a caricature, but they were trying to be more reserved and dignified. And so like that whole idea that they would rather be commit suicide than live a life of less dignity. Yeah. Well, that's because like they didn't want to be like emasculated by falling into these undignified ways of being. So the Epicureans and the Stoics, they would argue and they would debate about who was right and which school of thought, all that sort of thing. Sort of like how we might watch political debates in our day. In ancient times, there was not as clean of a break between the political world and the religious sphere. Yeah. And so then on top of those two philosophies, there was also just sort of the popular worship of the day, which was more engaged in the temple worship and all these pantheon of gods that we think about when we think of Greek mythology. And then because it was also Roman culture, they had the imperial cult. And so you sort of had normal people who they would go and sacrifice to Zeus or Poseidon or Athena or whoever they would. And then you had like the high thinkers, the philosophers, and they would they would like denigrate the normal people and they would look down on them. But they didn't really stir up too much trouble. They were like, I mean, that's fine for you. You're wrong about who the gods are, that sort of thing. But we'll play nice. So they didn't agree with the ways that the gods were worshipped, but they also tolerated it.
Yeah.
So
he meets these guys. They're all kind of talking in a circle, and they're like, "Who's this babbling fool?"
Right.
So they take him to the Areopagus. Is that how you say it?
I usually say the Areopagus.
Areopagus.
But Areopagus is also
Areopagus, whatever it is.
Areopagus is not correct.
I like it though. Areopagus. Areopagus. Which is again a place, and you kind of showed that.
Yeah.
What that looks like, where someone sits in a high place with authority to reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they're bringing him there. They bring him there. Would you, in your mind, to get to the bottom of things, or to get him in trouble? Like, what was your?
So the commentaries were disagreed on this point. So some people think that they're taking Paul there basically on trial. Some people think no, it wasn't that. They were just curious, basically. I think it's probably a mix of the two, because the Areopagus, they did bring people in constantly to hear new ideas. That was a part of their culture, and so I think that that was sort of the first reason why. But if they found out in the course of things that you were going to cause trouble, that you were stirring up people, that you were preaching something that was not allowed, then they would do what they did with Socrates, which is they would sentence them to death. So they were a think tank, but they were also the guardians of the culture and of the religious thinking of the day.
It's so different than our culture, but it's so intriguing to me. Like, it's such an intriguing. Like, it's this mob rule, but it's kind of not. It's like they really defended their perspectives, but they were open to dialogue. It's so fascinating to me.
Yes.
So they bring him there to keep moving along. There's so much in here, man. It's so good.
I know.
He then addresses, he says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious." He's encouraging them.
Right.
"For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of the heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man." And then he continues from there.
Yeah.
So talk me through this. So many layers here. But what was in their heart to, what does it reveal about the people there that they would leave a place with a altar or a idol to the unknown God? And talk me through Paul. I mean, this is an awesome evangelistic tool. He uses something that's already there to spark a conversation. So just kind of unpack that a little bit. So
there's a lot of things that the commentaries brought up about the altar to an unknown God. There was this story that kept getting repeated that, before I tell the story, part of the difficulty is they haven't found an altar to an unknown God in Athens. So in their archaeological work, they haven't found what Paul's talking about. They have found them in other ancient Greek cities that were contemporary. So they're not, they're around. Have they found one in Athens? They're not sure. But there's this story. I don't remember who. Maybe it's Philo or somebody that records it. But there's this story that at one time there was a plague in Athens, and they had tried to deal with the plague by sacrificing to all of their gods one at a time. So they would take these rams or these sheep, and they would sacrifice them at this altar, and they'd be like, "Please rescue us from this plague." And then the plague continued.
Yeah.
So eventually they got so fed up that they released a herd of sheep in this field, and wherever the sheep would lay down, they went and they sacrificed it there, and they built an altar to an unknown God. And then eventually that worked. It worked. The plague ended.
Yeah.
And so that's one explanation for why these altars were around at that time. But I think another, maybe that is the case, maybe not. I don't know, is the answer.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an interesting account, but whether that's true or not, what it reveals is that there's this impulse in humanity where we're trying to pursue God.
Yeah.
And what I said in my sermon is that there was this in a culture that worshipped so many gods, and that had a god for everything. So if you needed safe travel on the sea, you would go to the god of the sea and you would sacrifice at his altar to try to get his favor, right? So for them, it was all about appeasing the gods because the gods were very temperamental. They were more like really powerful humans than they really were like gods. So you were always trying to appease the gods, making sure they weren't too upset by sacrificing to them and by honoring them. So in that kind of a culture, you can imagine that at some point along the line, they would have asked, well, it's great that we're appeasing all these gods, but what if there's a God that we don't know about that we're accidentally offending by not worshiping them? And so there was this sort of fear of the unknown, but also this recognition that there could be something that's beyond what we've already discovered. And so they build these altars to try to guard against that possibility. It's like a catch-all altar. And so Paul just he runs across these catch-all altars, and he's like, yeah, well, Yahweh would fit into that. The God of the Old Testament is an unknown God to you. Even though there were Jews in the city, and yet they didn't really take that seriously. They viewed it as a separate thing. They didn't incorporate Yahweh into their practices. And so he's making a really bold statement by saying, you Athenians who are prized about your wisdom and your intellect, I'm going to talk to you actually about something that you're ignorant about. I'm talking to you about something that you worship in ignorance, in the lack of knowing. Even though there's so much that you already know, and you talk about stuff all the time, you're right in that there's something that you haven't yet discovered, and I want to reveal that God to you. So that's a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I got a question for you that just came to my mind.
Sure.
So one of the things that a lot of early missionaries struggled with when they would go to countries, especially places tribal in nature, like Africa, I would think Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, is that these tribes have multiple gods or ancestors. And so they'd go in and start talking about Jesus, and the people, they would have such a high conversion rate. Jesus is so great. Yes, we love Jesus. And these missionaries would feel so good about themselves. And then they would leave for a while or come back, or someone else would come back and begin to press in. And I've heard numerous stories of this. They begin to press in, and I come to find out the people were just like, oh yeah, Jesus and the rest of our ancestors.
Right.
They added in. It was just like, well, we'll accept your Jesus too. Like, sure. Like we already worship a pantheon of ancestors and gods. What's the difference of adding one more? And at face value, it seems like Paul's doing this too. He's saying, well, you have all these gods. Here's one more.
Right.
Why is he not doing that, would you say? What's the difference here?
I would say the difference is, so like that, the approach that you're talking about, if the missionaries were like, oh yeah, that's fine. So like, let's pretend that was the end goal. That is an approach. And if you think back to my sermon, that's all about building bridges and accommodating and contextualizing the gospel. And that's why it's so important that we're not just contextualizing.
That's right.
Because what that is called, what you're describing, it's called syncretism. It's when you take Christianity and you mix it with the local religion or the folk religion or the indigenous understanding, and it becomes this thing that's not quite Christianity, but it's not quite what it was before, and it's sort of like a mix of the two. Well, that's not how it works, and so Paul's not doing that. How do I know that? Well, it's because after he builds that bridge, he does not mince words.
That's right.
He doesn't say, so like, just if you could just add Jesus in, that would be great. He says, I'm here to proclaim to you something that you don't know about, but that you already are seeking after. And then from that point on, he makes a departure from that agreement. So I once heard a story about someone who was ministering to, I think it was a Buddhist, and they had all these idols in their house, all these gods. And they came to Christ. I don't know if this is like a real story or a made up story, but the Buddhist comes to Christ and they put a cross up on their wall where they have all their idols. And the person said, I knew that their conversion was legitimate because as I came back to their house, every time I came back, there were less idols on the wall. until eventually only the cross remained. And so it's like this beautiful idea that, yeah, maybe it doesn't all happen at once, but if it's a legitimate repentance, if it's a legitimate conversion over time, everything else is going to dim in comparison with Christ. And so I've seen that true in the lives of people that I've known who, maybe they weren't idol worshipers, but they had other things in their life where they were like, man, do I really need to give that up to follow Jesus? It's like, well, maybe not. It's a gray issue. It's a conscience issue. Well, let's just wait and see. And then through prayer, I come back 6 months later and they're like, oh yeah, I gave that up months ago. So I think that there's something special that happens when you do come to Christ, when he's at work in your life, that these other things get weeded out when you're pursuing him.
It is interesting too. I like the language you use there. He says, this just stood out to me. I found an altar with the inscription to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. And then he talks about the Lord. Yeah. And what he's saying in a sense is the unknown God, while I'm not advocating for you to add Yahweh or the Lord to your pantheon of gods, but he's drawing the attention of there is an itch you can't scratch. Yes. There is a need you can't fulfill with this unknown God. Let me proclaim to you the truth as to why that is. Yeah. Why this gap that you've created in this unknown God, why that's there. That's there because all of it's trash. All of it cannot satisfy. Yeah. All of it is in a sense pointing you to the God that can. And then he diverges from that, which I think is helpful language, quickly. And just lets him have it. Yeah.
And so what's interesting about this, just full disclosure, is that the commentaries that I was reading, this is where they got the densest. Because what they tried to do is they tried to show which phrases that Paul was using would have been offensive to the Epicureans, which would have been offensive to the Stoics, which would have been offensive to the popular idol worshipers. And that's where it got like, wow, okay, this is like, because they were quoting all these ancient writings from the Stoics, all these ancient writings from these different philosophical groups. And according to a lot of people, the Stoics and the Epicureans, even if you think back to what I said, the Stoics might agree that God created the world, or the Epicureans might have agreed that God created the world. The Stoics would agree that God is close at hand.
That's right.
And so Paul is he's clearly standing out against sort of all the idol worship, and yet the Stoics and the Epicureans, they might have been not sure how to feel about what Paul was saying. Maybe they partially agreed, partially disagreed. And it's only when you get to the idea of the resurrection that they're like, okay, this is ridiculous. Because universally they would have rejected the resurrection. So along the way, they might have been like, oh, that's, he's making a good point there, or no, I don't agree with that. Like the Stoics, for example, they didn't like all of the temple worship. They didn't believe that you could hold God in a temple because they believed that God was in everything. And so they would have agreed that, the gods aren't in temples built by human hands. But the popular idol worshipers would have disagreed with that. So all that to say, I think that the larger point still stands, that Paul does not sacrifice the message of the gospel in order to accommodate these people. Yeah. Although if you get really deep into the weeds, you can see like he may have been playing to the crowd a little bit at one point or more at another point. Some of this could be, and I mentioned this earlier, that because Paul grew up in Tarsus was one of the biggest hubs of Stoic philosophy apart from Athens. So he was well read in Stoic philosophy, most likely. So the scholars like to point all that out, and you can read all about that kind of stuff.
That's the cutting room floor for the cutting room floor.
Yeah, when I say it was dense, I mean it was like, I was like coming up for air constantly because I was like, what does this matter? What does this mean for me? Yes. It's interesting, it's fascinating, but the broader point is that Paul's building a bridge, but he's not compromising the truth, and that's what I tried to pull out for folks rather than getting into all those weeds and details. So, but that was tough, man.
Yeah, I bet. That's the hard work in the text, man.
Yeah.
How much are we good on time? How many? Couple more minutes?
Yeah, we probably got 10 more minutes.
Okay, so let's. I'm trying to think through, some of the points in your notes.
Sure.
I kind of want to land the plane and bring it home as we kind of finish working through this text. So he kind of digs in now. He's talking and he teaches on who this God is, right?
Yeah.
And we've already read a little bit about your favorite verse, and starting in verse 26 and things. So one thing you mentioned is Paul's method. He sees the people. Again, this is when he's in the marketplace in the synagogue, engaging with the Epicureans and the Stoics. He builds a bridge by talking about this God and talking in their context, and then the point is from there is to know God, and then point to Christ.
Yeah.
So to know God, who God is Himself enough, and help them understand and know God, but then ultimately point to Christ. So talk me through kind of those last two, the know God and point to Christ. Like, how does he move towards that? How does he wrap that up in this text?
Yeah. So, and I'm glad you brought this up because this is another really interesting thing. Mm-hmm. Paul does not say the name of Jesus in this speech, nor does he say the name Christ. He references Jesus, but he introduces Jesus as the rightful judge of humanity, who's appointed by God and who's accredited by the resurrection. Mm-hmm. There's a debate about whether or not Paul meant to end the speech where he did. Some people say, oh yeah, this is a complete speech. This was his mic drop moment, and then he sort of let things hang. I disagree. I believe that Paul, in his next breath, would have had a lot more to say to these people about Christ and about Jesus. And yet, because they couldn't handle the idea of resurrection, I do believe that they sort of interrupted him or were distracted, or Paul. I think Paul had more to say than he was able to. Now, on a strict reading of the text, that may or may not be the case, but that's just my conviction based on who Paul is, based on what he talks about in other places. He does point to Christ, he does point to Jesus, although not by name. But I believe he had so much more to say if they had been able to listen to him longer. That being said, though, that idea of knowing God is so important, because if we don't know who God is ourselves, then we won't know how to build that bridge to others, because we won't know where they're getting things right. If you don't know what the truth looks like, you won't be able to find the spark of truth in others. And so there's a need for us, in order to evangelize effectively, we need to know who God is. We need to know what he's like. We need to have an understanding of the scriptures so that we can share with others. Now, I said at one point, you don't need a college degree to share the gospel. I totally believe that. But you should have a relationship with God through Jesus. And that knowledge is enough for you to be like, that doesn't sound like God to me. Or that does sound like God to me. Let's dig in on that. Yeah. So knowing God is important. And because Paul knows God, he's able to connect with them. He's able to talk about who God is. He talks about God as the creator, God who made us, God who we're accountable to. And then he sort of lays this framework that, like, we owe God something. We owe everything to him, actually, because God gives us life and breath and everything that we have. Once he has that framework, then he transitions into pointing to Christ. He's like, because of this, because we are accountable to God, there's a solution that's necessary, and the solution is in Jesus. So he starts to make that transition, although he doesn't fully make the turn. And so for people who are wanting to follow Paul's example here, after you've built that relationship, after you've built that bridge, after you've found that common ground, you can do some work asking questions about, who do you understand God to be, or, asking probing questions. And then eventually you're going to run into one of these common issues that we face. The issue that, I don't always live as well as I should. That's something that's common to all people. The issue that my life is going to end one of these days. The issue that something is going on in the world that is frightening to me, or that I think is wrong. One of those three things, you're going to run into that eventually, and that's a great time to point to that and say, yeah, I know we don't live as well as we should. Life is going to end one of these days, and that's a tragedy. And there are things going on in this world that should not happen.
That's right.
That's that's when you can make that segue to point into Christ, because one of my friends told me this recently. If Christ isn't the answer to the problem of the human condition, there is no answer. So when you start identifying those issues, that's when you can point to Christ then. And so that's I mean, there's so much more to say here.
So as we kind of wrap up, continue with your thought and add this question. So when I look at Athens and the culture there, it's very similar to where we are now, where people aren't as connected to the church. We're seeing generations far removed from God, where maybe the idea of Christianity is a distant thing that their grandparents, followed, and they're thinking deeply though. So what are some practical things? You've already shared a couple of them, but what are ways that we're similar to Athens in our culture? And then what are maybe some other practical ways that if I'm leaving today and I'm going to engage with people, what does that look like? What are some questions or things that we can be, how can we equip people? So I'll leave you with that. It's kind of a big question, but good luck.
One similarity I think that I'm noticing more and more is that more and more people that I encounter like in real life are more and more open to spiritual things.
Dialogue.
So they may not be like church people. They're definitely not Christians. But I think there was a day in America when if you had walked up to someone and said, "Hey, can I pray for you?" They would have been like, "What, are you kidding me? Like you believe in that stuff still? Like I thought we proved that God doesn't exist. Haven't you read Nietzsche? Like God is dead. We left that behind." But the tide is turning, and I think more and more people are becoming more and more open to the fact that materialism, just living life by what you can see, feel, taste, touch, that is not getting us there. It is not working for people. They're bottoming out, and it's leading to all of these just really hard things in our society. Hopelessness, nihilism, alcoholism, like addictions. I think people are trying to fill this gap that they feel in themselves, and they haven't used God to fill it. Because of their materialistic understanding of the world. So anyhow, I think that's phasing out, and I think that more and more people are willing to treat God as an open question. They're maybe not so much atheists as they are agnostic.
That's right.
Maybe they're not saying there is no God for sure. That's dumb. Why would you think that? But they may say, "Man, I don't really know what's out there, but I know something is wrong." And so I think that's one way that we're getting more and more similar to Athens. Athens was, they recognized that there might be something out there that they didn't know. They were very interested in philosophy, talking about these things. So I think if you try to go like on Facebook and have these conversations, you'll get it's not going to go well.
That's right.
But if you actually go and meet people in real life and try to engage them in conversation, it tends to go a lot better.
Yeah.
A lot of times I think we might think that social media is the new Areopagus. Like social media is the new town square. So like we should go on social media and post about Jesus and preach to people. I really don't think that that's the case because social media is fake. Like it's not it's not real. Social media is designed not to be an open platform, but to get engagement. And so they're going to put you with people who you staunchly disagree with just because you'll keep posting.
Yeah.
Rather than actually putting you around people who might be willing to have a conversation.
Yeah.
So like going out in real life and just making friends, having conversations with people that don't know Jesus. I think you'll find more and more people are open, like the people of Athens were, to having these conversations.
I think you're so right.
And honestly, maybe that's a good place to just focus on that and encourage folks. Don't believe the lie that like social media is real life. Don't believe the lie that people don't want anything to do with Christianity. It's just not true.
It's true.
For the vast majority of people. They feel deeply these three things that I talked about. I don't live as well as I should. my life is going to come to an end one day, and there are things going on in the world that are frightening to me and that I think are deeply wrong. No matter what ethical framework they come from, no matter what philosophy they believe, whether they're materialist, like no matter where they're at, they all are wrestling with those three realities. Right. And every one of those three is an open door to sharing the gospel, because you're right. You don't live as well as you ought. You don't live, and your life is going to end. And when that life ends, we are going to owe God a death. And the only way to get out of our sin problem and out of our death problem is through the person Jesus Christ, through what he's done. And then that third idea that things are going on in the world that I think are wrong and bad, that's another just way to talk about sin. And yeah, things are wrong with the world. Shouldn't someone do something about it? Well, Christ has done something about it. He came to redeem the world. So all these things that, at the beginning of my sermon, I showed a video from Tim Keller where he talks about how, what do you do when the dots don't exist? And I think that that's so helpful, because I think a lot of the dots don't exist anymore. But those three dots that I just mentioned, absolutely, you can't get around them. Yeah. You can't escape these things. The human conscience, the reality of death, the reality of just the immutable moral compass.
Yeah. So good.
So there's lots of gospel conversations waiting to happen. It's really not a matter of, is this person open to it? It's more a matter of, are we willing in the midst of the waiting, in the midst of the discouragement, to step out and bring the conversation up.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I think, what that video, the Keller video at the beginning kind of showed, is continuing to remember to not use insider language.
Yes.
Because people don't understand the Christianese, we call it, or insider language anymore. It's time to ask good questions and meet them on where, like Paul did, on their playing turf, on their field, asking questions in their ways and engaging in their way, right? Even, some of those dense commentaries, one thing they reveal is that he's speaking to appeal to the mind of the Stoics and the Epicureans and the idol worshippers. Everything he says kind of appeals to a different group. And so he's not using Jewish Christian inside language. He's using language of the day and terms of the day and figures of speech of the day that they understood. So be a student of culture is what I would say. Be a student of culture.
Oh, yeah.
Understand the current events going on. I mean, the crazy things happening in the political world, or we're filming this today. We're right on the heels of the division coming right in front of our faces with attempted assassination of President Trump, and like that's an example of, if you're a student of the culture and you're willing to engage with somebody that comes to you and say, man, did you see what happened? Can you believe this? And also you're getting this diet, like it just seems like this world is so full of chaos, and where's the peace? And then it's just like, wow, there's a bridge right there. Right there is the bridge, right? And I know who can bring peace to this world. He already has. And then again, it's this beautiful language without having to use church language, so that's it's a thought I just wanted to end on, is that I think you're right, focusing on those three felt needs, but doing it on their turf and in their language and in their way.
Absolutely.
And one thing I've always said is, like, it's always better. You should always seek to be outnumbered. If you're outnumbered, you have the biggest platform to share the gospel. When they feel outnumbered, they will never listen. You should always strive to be in a situation where you are outnumbered by non-believers, because only then will they feel like it's their turf and you've entered in to have the conversation. And then they're always more willing to be open. That's an interesting thought. I've always chewed on that. How do I make sure? Because we always want people to come to our church, right? Come be outnumbered, right?
Yeah.
You're a non-believer. Come to our church. And that's great and all. But there's some beauty in, I'm willing to step out and be outnumbered to have that conversation. So,
yeah. And as a last note, there will be, because I think that sounds frightening to a lot of people. Yeah. Paul had a nightmare. Like a nightmare situation to deal with when it comes to trying to share Christ. Okay, fine. Like that. Like let it be scary. Let it be. It's okay if you don't have all the answers.
That's right.
Because that person's salvation does not rise and fall on you. It rises and falls on the work of the Holy Spirit in that person's heart. So even if they're rejecting what you're saying, this is one of the beauties of this text. Even though you could walk away and feel totally discouraged from what was going on with Paul and the Areopagus until you read. Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, and also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So
It's amazing.
even though there's this rejection wholesale, or like this disagreement about it, the Spirit is the one who's at work in people's hearts.
right.
So it's okay if people don't agree with you. It's okay if you don't like seal the deal and make the sale. Okay, fine. The Spirit is at work. If you're sowing the seeds, if you're helping people to ask questions, if you're pointing to Jesus, then you've been faithful. And that's what Paul did, and it bore fruit. And I believe it will in our lives as well.
That's good.
So
Good stuff.
all right, well, there's so much more to talk. Literally,
Yeah, it's good stuff.
So much to talk about. But it's great to have this opportunity to bring back some of these things to the surface and to walk through it. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and that it ministered to you, that it encouraged you in some way. If you've got more questions, feel free to reach out to us. I'm happy to share my commentaries if you want some dense reading. I can make some photocopies, just don't tell the publisher. No, I'm just joking. But I'd love to engage you more. If this sort of stuff feeds you, if you want to dig in deeper, let us know. We're always down to have more conversations and to dig in deeper to what the scriptures are saying. We love having these conversations with you and bringing you along. Really, you're the people that we do this for. We enjoy it, but our prayer is really that it's ministering to you. And so we look forward to having more conversations in the weeks to come. But until then, we're going to go ahead and sign off. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Open Door Cutting Room Floor podcast. But don't let the conversation end here. Find a group where you can deepen your roots at connect.opendoor.tv. And don't forget to submit your questions to podcast@opendoor.tv. Have a great week, and we'll see you Sunday.